Please welcome to the stage, Dean Karen Yarhi-Milo.
Hello, hi, good evening, everyone. Good to be. I heard the music. That's great. I'm Karen Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of SIPA, the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Affairs, and a proud co-founder of the Institute of Global Politics, which is the host of tonight's event. And it's really, really wonderful to welcome you to SIPA for what I know will be an important and timely conversation about the challenges facing American cities, especially our own New York City, as we approach a pivotal mayoral election. This is a moment of real urgency, as the shutdown of the federal government enters its 5th week, and with the effects of the White House Big Beautiful Bill Act finally being felt, the fiscal landscape of our major cities will be dramatically reshaped. Essential food programs like SNAP are about to expire, leaving 42 million Americans struggling to put food on the table. Federal budget cuts are also straining other services that millions of families depend on, from childcare to healthcare, while at the same time redirecting greater resources into law and immigration enforcement. All of this forms the backdrop to this evening's important discussion. This program reflects the very heart of SIPA's mission: to produce research that is not only rigorous and innovative, but that speaks directly to the pressing policy problems facing our communities, whether in New York City or in Nairobi. And few projects illustrate this commitment more vividly than Communities Speak, led by one of my favorite colleagues, Professor Esther Fuchs. By working in close partnerships with community organizations across the 5 bureaus, Esther and her team, which includes many of our own SIPA's students, have built one of the most comprehensive neighborhood-level data sets we have on affordability in New York. That is really incredible. And their findings could not be more urgent. 5 years after COVID-19 shuttered schools and daycare centers, entire swaths of our cities remain childcare deserts, while families either cannot find a seat for their child or cannot afford one. The Community Speak survey, which aggregate data across both time and neighborhood, tells a very clear story. And this is a federal funding from the American Rescue Plan provided a brief lifeline, but when that pandemic relief expired in 2023, deep structural weaknesses quickly resurfaced. High turnover, chronically low wages, and the closure of childcare facilities. So the supply shrank, costs spiked back to the pre-pandemic highs, and the ripples effect spread rapidly these days. As unemployment fell, housing costs rose, and food insecurity deepened, especially for single mothers in minority communities. So that kind of granular, data-driven research is Esther's work is really indispensable for policymakers, and it's so innovative and critical. It allows us to move beyond headlines and anecdotes to truly understand where the pain points are, neighborhood by neighborhood. It also highlights the interconnected nature of affordability, right? I mean, childcare, housing, and the food security, they cannot be addressed in isolation. So together, they define whether family can work, whether they can thrive, and stay in New York City and other urban centers across the country. So today's program is structured in 2 parts. Well, first, we're going to have a panel that will examine the impact of federal budget cuts on cities nationwide, as well as the effect of increases in federal spending on law enforcement and immigration. So that's going to be the first panel. Then we're going to have to turn to New York's next mayor, exploring what kind of policy agenda is needed to make our city more affordable, more resilient, and more equitable. I really want to extend my deepest gratitude to Esther and her team for leading this vital work, really, really leading it, and to our distinguished panelists from government, from academia, civil society, for sharing their insights tonight. And we have really a wonderfully fantastic slate of speakers this evening. I also want to thank IGP, the Institute of Global Politics, and in particular to its Faculty Policy Director, Secretary Jack Liu, for his indispensable contributions to this event and to many, many others that we're organizing every day. It's really around the clock here. And I want to thank our amazing, amazing IGP and SIPA events team, and especially Susan Lee, for pulling this event off without a hitch and for all of their hard work. They deserve a round of applause. Thank you. Finally, thanks to all of you in the audience for being part of this important conversation. What we do here at SIPA only matters if it reaches the communities it's meant to serve. And that's what we're here for. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Congressman Jerry Nadler and his wife Joyce, who will join us shortly. As you know, Congressman Nadler now represents New York's 12th district, but you also know that he was a longtime representative of New York's 10th district, which is the home of Columbia University. And he is a tireless champion for New Yorkers and has been a great, great friend to Columbia. So with that, let me turn the floor over to another favorite colleague of mine and Vice Dean, Robert Shapiro, who will moderate the first panel and introduce the panelists. Bob really needs no introduction. He is one of the best experts on American politics and public opinion, professor of government, professor of international public affairs here at SIPA, former chair of the political science department. Bob, thank you for everything that you do for this school. And the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome to the stage Jennifer Klein, Jacob Liu, Heather McDonald, Mark Morial, and moderator Robert Shapiro.
Welcome everyone. We have a lot to cover in a very short period of time, but I do want to give, albeit two brief introductions to our panelists. We have Jennifer Klein, who's a professor of professional practice and director of the IGP Women's Initiative here at SIPA. Before joining Columbia, Jen served as assistant to the president and director of the White House Gender Policy Council and has spent her career advancing the status of women and girls. Next, alphabetical order, Jack Liu, professor of international and public affairs, an IGP faculty policy director, and IGP faculty advisory board member here at SIPA. Jack was the 76th U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and formerly served as the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Next, we have Heather McDonald. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She is a contributing editor of City Journal and she's the New York Times bestselling author of The War on Cops. Last but not least, Mark Morial, who's the president and CEO of the National Urban League for over 20 years. He is the former mayor of New Orleans. I want to thank the panelists. First question, this is going to go to all the panelists. They're on a tight schedule here to give a concise response in 2 minutes to a big question that requires a big windup. On July 4th, 2025, President Trump signed H.R. 1, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, into law. The law permanently extends trillions of dollars of the year 2017 tax cuts. It adds new tax cuts and partially pays for these tax cuts through reducing federal spending by approximately $1.4 trillion in changes to programs, which include Medicaid, SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and student loan programs. In a few words, big question, but a few words in response, what do you see as the main impact of these cuts on cities? And I'm going to go through the panelists, starting with Jen, Jack, Heather, and Mark. Jen, the floor is yours.
So I think it's first of all, thank you, Bob, and thank you to all of you for coming to this. I think this is, to state the obvious, an incredibly immediately important topic. I think this is an issue of simple math. Cities rely on federal dollars for programs, as the dean already said, to provide nutrition, health, education support, housing, childcare, other essential services, including, from my perspective, for women and girls. And the cuts that we are seeing and anticipating will disproportionately affect women and families. Cities will face pressure to fill the gap left by these draconian cuts to these programs that support vulnerable residents. And in many, if not all places, it's impossible to fill those gaps. Cities are unable to do that, particularly given existing budget constraints and financial instability. So women and families will be at greater risk when cities are forced to respond by cutting services.
Thank you. Jack, you're up.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you all for being here. I think you have to look at the cuts, as Jen was saying, in terms of the direct impact and the indirect impact. And the direct impact is fairly easy to trace. If you lose your health coverage and affordability of healthcare is a problem, it is something that forces you to choose between taking a huge part of your disposable income to maintain healthcare coverage or putting yourself at risk. So you've got the internal family trade-off. Same is true if you lose your SNAP food benefits. It means more of your income either goes for food or other things. I agree with Jen, and we're going to talk more about this later. It's going to be very hard to backfill those gaps. So you're going to see within families and within communities this trade-off where the numbers just don't work. If you think about the loss of coverage for well over 1 million people in New York State, if the state of New York covered all of that to say we're not going to let people lose health care coverage, it means the funding that goes from the state to the city for everything else, from education to law enforcement to childcare, is reduced. So it's a little bit like squeezing water from one side of the balloon to the other. There obviously is a possibility of bringing more revenue in. That's not an easy thing to do. And I think one of the things that I'm going to focus on today, and I think is going to be a challenge here in New York, but all over, is with the burning need to address affordability issues, creating a desire for new initiatives. The first challenge is going to be, how do you stabilize the situation for the things that are being lost? And how do you trade off those concerns for the new issues? And ultimately, it comes down to how much resources you have available, which means, are you willing to pay for it?
Thank you. Heather.
Well, these are not absolute cuts. They're reductions in the rate of increase each year, going from, would have been 4.6 annually in Medicaid over a decade to still going to rise 2.7% annually for the next decade. There are savings, as Professor Shapiro said. How are those arrived at? I would say imminently reasonably. 1/3 of the savings comes from asking able-bodied recipients of Medicaid who are not working to do 20 hours of some form of work or community service a week. Again, these are able-bodied people on Medicaid. If you are a female, if you're pregnant, if you're a caregiver or disabled, you're not going to be asked to do 20 hours of community service. But again, I would say that's reasonable. You're getting something from the taxpayers. Time studies show that the able-bodied on Medicaid who are not working are spending 4 hours a day watching television and nearly another 2 hours in other forms of entertainment. Another 1/3 of the reduced spending comes from getting rid of, frankly, a Ponzi scheme by which states were charging hospitals a tax for Medicaid, getting federal money back from the feds, and then giving it back to the hospitals. It was a total sleight of hand. And the other was for increased eligibility verification. Again, this seems reasonable to me. Proving that you are in fact eligible for taxpayer benefits seems to me a good management technique. Quickly, I'll just finish by saying I would argue that cuts in entitlement spending in one sense do not affect cities because that's not the core mission of cities. It's not to be distributing welfare benefits either from federal dollars or local. The core mission of cities is to create jobs, to allow human beings to realize their full potential by creating an environment where commerce is encouraged, possible, above all by maintaining public safety, infrastructure, transportation, and that is not affected by cuts that are reasonable in entitlement spending.
Thank you. Mark.
First of all, good afternoon. Thank you all very much. Let me be candid, straight up. The mission of a city is to take care of the people that live in the city, the residents of the city. If you cut health care for residents of the city, the responsibility, Mayor Nutter, will be in City Hall. The homeless, the needy. They'll be at the city council meetings, at the school board meetings, at the public housing authority meetings, at the mayor's residence sometimes, looking for relief. What I call the big ugly bill was a massive wealth transfer by gutting important programs that Medicaid is not a welfare program. It's a health care program for people who are not adequately served because of affordability by the private health insurance market. And that's the vision of it, and it has worked well. Do there need to be changes? Yes. The wealth transfer was to transfer significant benefits to 813 people in America who are billionaires. All of the other tax cuts are crumbs. They pale in comparison to the benefits that were provided in this bill to the wealthiest of Americans. The bigger question for students and public policy experts is the dismantling of the 20th Century Compact, the dismantling of the idea that the tax code should be progressive in nature, the idea that government's role was altered in the days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I wanted to go look at some numbers. 1933, the poverty rate in America was 50%. The unemployment rate was 25%. After the New Deal, after the Great Society programs, after the advances, by the time you got to 1969, the poverty rate was 12%. Higher for African Americans, of course, higher for some other communities. But the point is that the 20th Century Compact of civil rights and the redefining of government improved the quality of life for Americans. Now in the 21st century, with the big ugly bill and other measures, that is being completely dismantled. The pain is going to be felt not only by the poor, it'll be felt by the aspiring middle class and middle class Americans who can't afford to make ends meet. So it's a bigger discussion than policy minutia, ladies and gentlemen. It's a discussion about the role of government, the role of the private sector, and how we balance all of this in an economy today which is $30 trillion. $30 trillion in GDP. Can we provide in that kind of economy for a quality of life for the majority of Americans? Not just for those that have a whole lot. I'm not bashing people with money. I one day want to be a billionaire. Let me state for the record, right? But I do believe that the issues here are much broader than a discussion. This big, ugly bill is already wreaking havoc on the American people. And when you combine it with this effort, which began after the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare to repeal the Obama health care program, all of this is a continuum to wipe that out. Americans will pay. Americans will be sicker. They won't live as long. Seniors will not have health care. This is what we are facing today. And I challenge anyone to offer any credible narrative as to what the impact indeed will be. Cities are responsible for their people, not just for their potholes. They're responsible for their people, not just for their pipes. They're responsible for their people. And all of those challenges that are going to come as a result of this are going to fall at the feet of state and local government, while the federal government seems like some leaders want to just wash their hands, Congressman Nadler, of the situation. That's the real deal, ladies and gentlemen, that we face today.
Thank you. The panelists are welcome to respond to each other within their allotted time, but I have a specific question I want to follow up with Jack and Heather on. Jack, tell us more about how these budget cuts will affect the affordability crisis cities already face.
So I don't disagree with Heather that a lot of these cuts are to individuals and they're not broad fiscal impacts in the first instance. But I also agree with Mayor Morial that cities and states can't just watch that happen and do nothing if it means a massive loss of health care coverage and a massive loss of access to sufficient nutrition to feed their families. So I think the burden is in New York State for the first year, according to the state comptroller, is about $750 million. But it grows every year. Over 5 years, it's roughly speaking, $30 trillion. And that's a big hole. Now, you don't have to fill all the hole. Some people can maybe buy their own health insurance. You can say you're not going to make everyone whole, but New York has a Medicaid program that covers a lot of people. If there are 1.5 million people who are no longer covered by that, the question is, do they go without health care? New York's a little unusual since the city has its own independent funding of Medicaid. How does that work between the city and the state? It's going to create a massive pressure, a vice, on how do you provide social services? How do you pay for education? How do you pay for police? I think actually right now is a very difficult time to even think about having new spending initiatives because there's going to be a need to fill so many holes that the question will be, how do you make ends meet if you keep people who need health care and nutrition programs at a level that's sufficient? It's not just New York City or New York State. I mean, 49 states have some form of a balanced budget requirement, different forms in every state. That means every year they've got to make a decision, within a fixed constraint, where does the money go? If they lose a big chunk of federal funding, that means their funding for education might not be where it was the year before. Their funding for public works won't be where it was the year before. I think if you just dive into New York a little bit and ask the areas of affordability, what are the topics that people usually talk about, they're all affected by this. In healthcare, there's a $7.5 billion New York State essential health plan that covers 1.7 million people. The question is, how is that going to be funded? SNAP cuts could reduce benefits for as many as 1 million people in New York. If you look at housing, one of the main affordability areas, there's something positive in the bill. It extends a low-income housing tax credit and some other provisions that are a small part. I'm proud to have had a hand in creating the low-income housing tax credit, so I'm not going to criticize a provision that makes it permanent. But there's a 43% cut overall in tenant-based rental assistance, public housing, project-based rental assistance. That's what keeps affordable housing affordable. The CDBG program, the block grant, community development block grant, was eliminated. And you get to issues like childcare. There's something in the bill that is positive. There's a childcare tax credit, but it's not a refundable credit, so it doesn't go to people who need it the most, people who are just above or just below the poverty level. So I think these are big problems. When I look at what it means for a city right now, my job as an OMB director and Treasury Secretary was the numbers had to tie at the end. For the numbers to tie here is going to mean tough decisions. Before you make a new commitment, you have to answer the question, what am I doing about maintaining things that people are losing? When you do a multi-year projection, you have to take into account that it's not just the first year of the cuts, but it's as they're implemented over the next 5 years. And you have to look at the costs of new things that you're doing in an unvarnished way, or else you're going to create a fiscal crisis. And I lived through the New York City fiscal crisis. Doing that again would be a terrible thing to do to the city. And I think serious thought has to be given to how states use their rainy day fund reserves. New York State has a $30 billion rainy day fund. You could say if you have a $30 billion problem, you got $30 billion. What happens if it rains? We could go into a recession and say, oh my God, we need that money. So I'm not a big advocate of drawing down all your fiscal capacity to deal with a manufactured crisis, which in manufactured, I don't mean it in the pejorative sense. This was not an unavoidable thing. This was a result of policy. A recession or natural disaster just fall upon you. And revenues are going to be an important subject. I worry deeply about the tax burden in New York driving people who are wealthy and have a lot of assets out of the city, because even though there are not that many of them in number, they pay a disproportionate percentage of the taxes, and the whole system needs to have that group of people in the city. So I don't think there's unlimited ability to just raise taxes to solve these things. So I think it's a predicament. Whoever is going to be dealing with these issues is going to have no easy solutions.
Thank you. Heather.
If I could briefly just respond to
Sure.
Mayor Morial and say I completely agree with you. Cities are responsible for their people, and the most important way they're responsible is maintaining public safety. Not a single one of the assaults on commuters, on subway riders, on people walking on the streets by the mentally ill, chemical addicted, the MICA population, should have happened. Those were all preventable. They were all completely foreseeable. These are, as Mr. Liu said, this is the result of policy. These are policy choices with regards to incarceration, policy choices with regards to treatment of the mentally ill, with regards to allowing people to stay on the streets. So yes, I would say that every time that happens, and it will happen again, we will have more of these subway pushings, we will have more of these assaults. The public officials who have been doing anything but making sure these don't happen again are liable. As far as the affordability crisis and these recent cuts in entitlements in Medicaid and requiring SNAP again, I just want to reassert, all it's asking is that if you are able-bodied and you're not working, do something. And if you're going to walk away from Medicaid benefits because you have been asked to do 20 hours a week of community service, I would argue you're not all that hard up, because that is not unreasonable. You're not doing anything otherwise. So same with SNAP. If you're able-bodied and you're not working, it seems to me reasonable that you can give something back to the taxpayers. But again, I would say that the question of these cuts is tangential to the affordability crisis. Cities across the country vary massively in their cost of living and their affordability. Why? Not because of federal entitlements, but because of their own state and city policies with regards to housing, with regards to energy, with regards to job creation. The New York University Furman Center for Real Estate and Public Policy found that rents and construction costs in New York could be 25% lower without the regulatory barriers and tax barriers that New York puts along the way to try and build something. They've got all these taxes that are pretty unusual elsewhere. Transfer taxes, when you buy the property, you pay a tax. When you get a mortgage, you pay a tax. All of this is collected by the city for its own subsequent social service spending, raising the costs of building, driving down supply, and raising rents on the non-rent subsidized buildings. We have, in this city, it's the most expensive city in the country to erect a 15-story building. Not just in New York, it's more expensive in the Bronx to erect a 15-story building than any other city in the country because of the barriers we put to housing here. The amount of permits that we require, the difficulty of getting a construction permit. As far as energy costs, again, this is the result of policies in California, in New York, with regards to the types of energy that are allowed, shutting down gas plants, shutting down nuclear. These, again, are policy choices. Food prices, if you want more food availability, public safety is another key. You had Target in East Harlem pulling out in 2023 because its shoplifting costs were so high. Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in Manhattan, refuses to prosecute shoplifting. We make it also very hard to cite buildings. There was a big union fight against bringing in Walmart, and we wouldn't allow it to be cited in New York City. As a result, the people that have cars, that have the ability to do so, drive outside of New York to buy at Walmart in Westchester County. But people that don't have that option are stuck with much fewer choices. So I would say the affordability crisis is something of New York's own making that could be solved by cleaner regulations, making sure that we are not simply adding on taxes for the sake of raising money, and we're driving the middle class out. We have a barbell economy with the very poor that are on entitlements here, the very rich, but middle class jobs, businesses are moving them out. They don't have to be in New York, so they're going to lower cost cities, decreasing opportunities for New Yorkers that want to get a job and move up in life.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to Mark and Heather. I want to give Jen a chance to say a little bit more. Jen, how will these budget cuts affect women and families in particular?
Well, I'll start by agreeing with pretty much everything Jack said, and I'll just sort of
Okay.
put the lens of women and families on that, because many of the themes you will hear are what Jack already started with. But, of course, we also start from a place where families are already feeling the pressures of rising inflation and increased tariffs. Tariffs have, for example, increased prices for baby basics and back-to-school supplies. And the budget cuts that we are seeing now will make services inaccessible, or at least very much harder to access, which, as I said, will just build on economic stresses that are already being felt by women and families. On Medicaid in particular, women and families will be particularly harmed by these budget cuts. And food assistance through SNAP is another example. Women make up 57% of adult Medicaid beneficiaries. Women are 6 in 10 Medicaid enrollees who are nursing home residents, and the majority of Medicaid enrollees receiving home and community-based care. Women also make up 63% of adult SNAP beneficiaries. The cuts to Medicaid will also directly negatively impact the care workforce, which is, of course, predominantly made up of women, particularly women of color. Medicaid is the key mechanism to fund compensation for direct care workers, including home care workers and nursing home assistants. And of course, these workers are already underpaid and undervalued for the work that they do. And the 11 million family caregivers who just depend on stipends from Medicaid to afford to care for their loved ones at home risk seeing these stipends disappear as states and cities are forced to make difficult choices. The shutdown, the federal government shutdown, has only exacerbated the impact of these budget cuts on critical programs, and we've heard some about that. And in addition to the cuts that Jack outlined to SNAP and WIC and other vital programs, the proposed budget cuts for the administration's current budget for fiscal year 2026. I'll add another feature, seeks to reduce funding for the Department of Justice's Office of Violence Against Women by 30%. Near and dear to my heart, one of the things that I've worked on for 30 years, but most recently in the last 4. Cut from about $700 million per year to $500 million a year. And what that translates into, because those are big numbers, but what that translates into is it imperils critical grant programs that provide life-saving support to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other manifestations of violence against women. And by the way, the grant managers for many of these programs were just furloughed, prompting concerns that this essential office, the Office of Violence Against Women, that was established 3 decades ago, huge bipartisan support, will literally be permanently weakened. Finally, the administration's cuts to the federal workforce have actually already particularly impacted women. Women make up 46% of the federal workforce in 2024, but interestingly, they made up the majority of the workforces in some of the agencies that received the biggest cuts. For example, the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services were both 63% women. So what does this boil down to? What does this mean for cities and for states and their citizens? Ultimately, the states and cities will, as we've mentioned, be forced to fill the gaps for these vital programs. And many cities and states are literally unable to do so. They don't have the funds to do so. They don't have the budget authority to do so. And will end up having to make really tough choices to cut essential services and programs for their residents. Another factor here is that some states and congressional districts are more dependent on Medicaid, for example. In Louisiana, half the state depended on Medicaid in 2023. And in New York, Medicaid covers a wide range, 15% in some districts to 71% in other of New York's congressional districts, which is a wide range, obviously, that will result in a patchwork of coverage. So that in some places, families, particularly those living in cities and districts with larger, lower income populations, will suffer more.
Thank you. Okay, I've got 2 aspects I want to follow up with Mark and Heather. Mark, how will these budget cuts affect communities of color?
In a significant way, but one thing I wanted to let everyone know, we just built a 17-story building here in New York City, 117, 125th Street, right in this neighborhood. I know a little bit about building 15-plus story buildings. The permitting from the city and the state went swimmingly well. No obstacles, no problems. And number 2, that Target you mentioned is now in our building at 117, 125th Street, along with Trader Joe's, Sephora, and Pandora. Just want everyone to know, Target didn't leave, they just moved to a new location that's in the building that the National Urban League owns, which is our new headquarters, which is the largest building built in Harlem in 50 years. We're proud of that. These budget cuts, so the fiscal and moral bankruptcy of the plan is that at the end of the day, the plan did not reduce the deficit. It increased the deficit. The fiscal and moral bankruptcy of the plan is that it cut Medicaid, it cut SNAP, it eliminated CBDG, and it transferred money, billions of dollars, to a domestic police force called ICE. Billions of dollars to an increased military in the United States of America. It didn't cut. What happened to Ronald Reagan's fiscal deficit reduction philosophy? This plan just took money over here, like a game of New York 3-card Monte, and moved it over here. From domestic programs that impact the most vulnerable Americans over to ICE and the military and the wealthiest of Americans. We already see with stagnant growth, we already see with 300,000 black women being laid off in March of this year. You already see with the black unemployment rate rising almost 2% in less than 8 months alone in this year, the beginning of the impact, the disproportionate impact this is going to have on communities of color. Watch the numbers. Watch them very, very closely and judge it by the numbers. The unemployment numbers, the decrease in home ownership amongst Black and Latinos that will result as a result. Think about what Jack said. Cutting the Section 8 program, eliminating the CBDG program, eliminating the commitment of the GSEs to affordable housing. Where are we going in America today? What's the end result? It certainly wasn't to cut the deficit, because it did not do that. In fact, it increased the deficit to a greater extent than we've seen. So this is going to be devastating for communities of color, but for white Americans too, and for Latino Americans too, and for women too, and for men too. Not just. The fallacy for some people is that Medicaid is a Black and a brown program. The majority of Medicaid recipients, or rather the plurality, 40+%, are white Americans, right? Black and Latino Americans participate in that program. The fallacy of the argument is the narrative that somehow Medicaid is being disproportionately benefiting people laying in their basement not working, when in fact 80% of Medicaid recipients either work, or they're retired, or they're disabled. These are the facts. So this fiscal plan, in my view, is both bankrupt from an economic point of view and from a moral point of view. I am not afraid to talk about the moral compass in America, because it is the moral compass in America that built the 20th century, defeating Nazi Germany, the civil rights movement, the women's suffragist movement. That moral compass built the America we enjoy today. And so, am I outraged about what I see? I'm outraged about what I see. And everyone should be outraged by what they see, because the arrows are not pointing in the right direction when we look at the impact on people. If you had cut spending and not transferred money, and at the end of the day, you say, we took half of the deficit away. We took half, then maybe you have a credible argument. This plan has no credible argument, but a shift of resources from one set of priorities to another set of priorities. And I believe that communities of color, plus all Americans, are going to eventually be hurt and damaged by this. And some next administration, next government, will be here picking up the pieces and trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to follow up on one point you raised with Heather. Okay, one of the major pieces of the One Big Beautiful Act was the dramatic increase in federal funds for immigration enforcement. And recently, President Trump has deployed the National Guard in cities across the country. Historically, law enforcement, however, has been a local function. Heather, what do you think about these policies?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I totally agree with Mayor Morial, and I hope we can have a coalition of we've got to decrease the deficit. We keep pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off. So I totally agree. I think that's got to be the measure of our policy at the federal level from now on, does it reduce the deficit? I would also say, though, for those 80% of Medicaid recipients who work or are disabled, they're not affected by the bill. If you're working, you still get your Medicaid. It's people who are not working and who are able-bodied who are now going to be asked to work. That's all they have to do. They'll still get their Medicaid. So again, I think these are fair tweaks to the program. As far as the emphasis on law enforcement, the ICE within the bill, on August 11th, Trump gave a speech that said it was Liberation Day in Washington, D.C. He said, we're taking our city back. We're rescuing it from crime and squalor. I would say that was an important moment in his presidency, because it signaled a willingness to break away from what has been the dominant philosophy towards crime and other forms of social problems, which is defining deviance down. Trump said, the level of crime in D.C. is no longer acceptable. What is that level of crime? And what was interesting, when he said this, everybody rushed to defend D.C. crime because crime had dropped in 2024 compared to 2023. So therefore, everything was okay. No problem here. Nothing to see here, folks. Move on. Okay, so what's going on in D.C.? July 5th, 3-year-old Honesty Cheadle at a barbecue, 4th of July barbecue, was shot in a drive-by shooting and died. May 2024, another 3-year-old, Taya Settles, was in a car, again shot in a drive-by shooting, died. That same day, there was a 17-year-old student at Dunbar High School who was shot in the head while in a classroom because there was a shootout outside of the school. About 3 juveniles a day on average in recent years are shot in DC. The homicide rate in DC is 27 per 100,000 residents. Compare that, say, to London, which is 1 homicide per 100,000. Switzerland, it's 0.48. So you have a level of homicide in DC that would be considered a national emergency anyplace else. It's 27 times that of London and 60 times that of Switzerland. You have 14 carjackings, 10 violent crimes a day. This is not acceptable. And Trump had authority to call in the National Guard to Washington, D.C. But again, what was most important was him saying, I'm not going to excuse this. Again, government has the responsibility to protect its citizens. It has not been doing that. As far as funding for immigration functions, one of the great congresswomen in American history, Barbara Jordan, was asked by President Clinton to lead a task force on immigration reform. She came out staunchly against illegal aliens, against illegal immigration. She said this has to be stopped. Illegal aliens have no claim on the country. They have no right to be here. Cesar Chavez was a huge opponent of illegal aliens. He felt that they were driving wages down. They were taking jobs away from American farm workers. And the reason that Trump called out what was going on in Los Angeles when he called out the National Guard, they had started enforcement around work sites. What was going on? You had people shooting off M80 firecrackers at ICE officers that had been loaded up with nails and broken shards of glass. You had concrete blocks being thrown off of an overpass on the 101 freeway downtown on the California highway patrol officers below. You had a attempt to break into a car to turn it over with a female officer inside. You had Waymos being summoned for their fiery execution. The fire department didn't respond to those fires because it could not get enough protection from the police. A day after Gavin Newsom declared that everything was under control, LA Police Chief Jim McDonald said the city is out of control. He put the LAPD on tactical alert, removing their days off, removing their time off. The next day, Karen Bass put a curfew on the city because the rioting was so bad. The law that Trump used to invoke the National Guard there allows him to call up the Guard if federal law enforcement is unable to execute the laws. The Ninth Circuit upheld that call-up. The Ninth Circuit has also upheld a call-up in Portland, which saw similar levels of violence being directed at ICE officers, the same improvised explosive devices loaded up with chains, rammings. Portland police saying we're not going to help. Chicago police saying we're not going to help. I would say this is an extremist. Obviously, should not be the norm, but enforcing immigration law is an appropriate function of the federal government. And if there is organized opposition to prevent that enforcement from occurring, I think that one needs to look at mechanisms for protecting federal agents as they go about their lawful duties.
Thank you. Mark.
Let me say
Yes.
something. First of all, Martians are illegal aliens. Undocumented immigrants are not aliens.
Legal term.
It's a pejorative, negative term.
Change the
We
statute.
did not call Italian and Irish and Jewish immigrants that came here 100 years ago illegal aliens. We can have a discussion without the pejorative assertions, which are just designed to divide people. Number two, Mr. Trump blocked a comprehensive immigration bill, which would have put into place a permanent mechanism to solve this issue. What is happening now is not a sustainable policy. Sending in the National Guard, having ICE raids where you end up with 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 to 150,000 people in detention centers that we are paying for, that it may take, with the way the immigration system works, 10 years for them to get an expulsion hearing or hearing. This is not a sustainable policy. It's performative and it is political. Number two, I don't see why ICE agents should run around masked. I don't think any law enforcement should run around masked. I'm from the South. Masks were worn by the Ku Klux Klan. When they were trying to defend masks here, I was against it. And I'm still against it. I don't think people should be wearing masks in public at a protest, nor do I think that law enforcement officers, if you will, enforcing immigration law should be wearing masks. This is what's important. Now, number two, in Washington, D.C., in the Chinatown area, I have a member who owns a fairly significant business there. Since the National Guard has come, his business is down 50%. He said, oh, the National Guard walking the streets doesn't make the people of Washington feel safer. It conveys the message that this area is dangerous. So all across the nation, the question is this an efficacious policy? Then number two, talk to National Guardsmen, got friends in the National Guard, ask them what they're doing. We'll say, we just kind of on patrol. We're walking around areas that are visible, but we really have no fundamental function in this. This is not a sustainable policy. It's expensive, and there are better ways to fix the country's problem when it comes to the undocumented. And unless we get together, this is what we're going to see. A militarization of our cities. Why is foreign tourism down? You can't compare gun violence in the United States to gun violence in London, Berlin, or Paris. You can't get a gun. You can't get a gun. In this city, if you look at the highest rates of violent crime, you're going to find a lot of smaller cities, a lot of medium-sized cities. If you use that theorem to send in the National Guard would also be going to a whole host of other cities. I just think it's an improper use of the National Guard. The National Guard is very valuable. In New Orleans, we brought them in for special events like the Super Bowl. They came in and then they departed. In New Orleans, we used them for hurricane and flood response. They did a fantastic job. There's a role and a reason. It's not a sustainable policy. It's too expensive. The guardsmen are usually working on leave from full-time employment. And so if we're going to talk about it from a policy perspective, the question is it really going to make a difference? You want to make a difference on crime? Fund some more investigators, right? Get people an opportunity to solve some of these problems. There's ways, what most presidents do, if they want to deal with violence in an American city, Mayor Nutter, they'll call us up on the phone. They'll come see mayors. That's what President Bush did, President Obama, President Clinton, not just unilaterally orchestrate some kind of policy, right, without any notice and without any participation. It's not sustainable, folks. It's dividing the country. And at the end of the day, it will in all likelihood not have the intended effect. If a mayor says, Mr. President, help me put the guard in here to help me with the following issues, that's a different type of situation. And I can absolutely tell you that in Washington, D.C., it's damaging retail businesses downtown, right? It is damaging retail business. Now you can't count because you got a shutdown going on and people are not coming downtown. But this is the effect. So is that the price we pay? That, okay, crime is down and no one goes out and no one goes and shops and no one goes to restaurants and no one goes to clubs and no one goes to the street. So we got to look at this with a much clearer eye in terms of whether these are sustainable policies or they're designed for reaction, designed for attention, designed to create the appearance of doing something when in fact you're really not going to do it. I'm really concerned that we're going to have 250,000 people in these detention centers. And we're going to be paying for them, Jack, for months and months and years and years and years because you can't send them away. They need a hearing. What are we going to do? Just continue to pay? Let's look at the fiscal note on the National Guard. Let's look at the fiscal note on the detention system. Let's look at the fiscal note on the increase in ICE and ask ourselves if that cost yields a benefit commensurate with the investment.
Thank you. All right. Now that our capable panel has answered all of the easy questions, unfortunately, we had one question left that we can't get to. It has to do with how are cities going to solve these problems, and are there models out there to deal with those kinds of things? Unfortunately, we can't get to that. All I'm left with is thanking the panel for an excellent session, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Jennifer Jones Austin, Rafael E. Sestero, John Liu, Catherine Wild, and moderator Esther Fuchs.
Hello, darling. Okay. Wow, that was an amazing panel. And there's so much to cover, and I have this great panel, so I'm trying to get to it. Before we begin our discussion, I just have to do quick thank you, because there's so many people who made this happen today. The dean thanked the staff at IGP, but I need to thank Ashley McQuarrie Tomei and Harini Sundarajan, my project director and assistant director for Community Speak, because without them, there would be no Community Speak, which means there would be no survey and we would have no data. So thank you. And a special thank you to our community partners, because we have a number of them here with us today. Especially thank you to Gretchen from ABC. We know her for a long time here at SIPA. She was a dear friend of Mayor Dinkins, and she continues the legacy in her work at Association to Benefit Children. Thank you, Gretchen. Some of our new friends and partners, New York Common Pantry, POTS, and my special thank you to Lisette Nieves of the Fund for the City of New York. She is a force of nature and has been doing amazing work at the fund. And we also have a couple of partners from the City Council, Council Member Hudson, Council Member Guterres, Brewer, and Megan Lynch from the Speaker's Office. Okay. Before we begin, I want to share 2 data points from our just released Community Speak policy briefs, because they do provide a context for this panel discussion. The Dean alluded to some of these issues in her remarks. In 2024, 43% of families with young children reported in our survey to not being able to afford childcare. This nearly matched the pre-COVID-19 peak levels. By the spring of 2025, affordability challenges did persist but dropped, and I'm bringing that to our attention. They dropped to 29%. Because policy can make a difference. That's part of our message today. We need public policy to focus on these questions. We need our advocates. We need our community partners. But government has to intervene to scale things up and make a difference. We need to continue to focus because we're not there yet. On housing affordability, we're all familiar with the rent is too damn high. Boy, that guy was really ahead of his time, right? New Yorkers are experiencing historic challenges in housing affordability. We found 1 in 4 New York City households to continue facing difficulties affording rent. And just as important, and maybe more important, are that these challenges are acute for low-income households, Black and Hispanic residents, people with disabilities who have been left out of every study and conversation that I've seen, non-English speaking households, and communities in the Bronx. So that's the premise for where we begin. Oh boy. I just have to introduce our speakers. This is really an exceptional group of New Yorkers who have been deeply engaged for decades in assuring that our city government works effectively, efficiently, and equitably. There are 3 E's, not 2, equitably for all New Yorkers. And I hope that whoever becomes our next mayor listens to their advice and works to implement their policy proposals. Now for the drum roll. I begin with Jennifer Jones Austin, and I can only do very brief bios. Jennifer is the CEO of the Federation for Protestant Welfare Agencies. She is a 4th-generation social justice leader and lawyer who has led the Federation in policy advocacy, coalition building, structural reform to serve underserved New Yorkers. Jennifer is one of my heroes. I'm so glad you could be with us today. Rafael Sestero, who is the CEO of the Community Preservation Corporation. Rafael previously served as commissioner for the New York City's Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development, and now leads CPC's efforts in affordable housing finance and community development, doing extraordinary work. Thank you. And John Liu, I'm going to lead with the title that nobody knows about. John is an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia SIPA. And yeah, see, there's people in this room who know about that. And he is, of course, New York State Senator for the 16th District in Northeast Queens and was the New York City Controller. John, you just do it all, and we're just so lucky to have you here teaching municipal finance. Amazing. All right, the last but not least, Catherine Wild. Now, I would like to say Kathy Wild, but since we've been so formal in all our announcements here, I'm saying Catherine Wild. But really, Kathy is the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City since 2011. And I don't know, Kathy, I just can't see that organization or the city functioning without you. You have been good. And you better not be going anywhere. I don't want to see you in Puerto Rico for most of the time. I want to see you staying here. Okay, I got that off my chest. Okay, so let's get going. We just had a really excellent panel on the impact of the federal budget cuts, so I want to begin our panel discussion with a similar question, but with a focus on New York City. So briefly, and I know it's not a brief question, I'm asking all the panelists this question, and I'm going to begin with Jennifer, and we'll go down the line. What do you see as the main impact of changes in federal policy and budget cuts on New York City? Just the main impact. We know there's a lot. Thanks, Jennifer.
Glad to be here, honored, and very appreciative to Mayor Nutter and to you, Esther, for ensuring that I had a seat at the table, if you will. Let me just first say that it's very important in this moment that at every point in time we debunk false narrative. And so let me just first say that this whole notion about D.C. being in, like a danger to everybody walking the streets of D.C. D.C. is not on the top 25 most dangerous cities in the United States list. Chicago is not. And these are cities, just two of the cities, that this president targeted. It was not simply about the most dangerous cities. It was about using the militarization of our law enforcement as a form of oppression. Let's just call it what it is, because that is what is done when you use the military against United States citizens when there is no crisis. It's militarization in the form of oppression, or oppression in the form of militarization. The other thing I just quickly need to say is that New York did not create the affordability crisis all by itself. If they did, then what is happening around the United States of America, where if you go county by county, state by state, you see an affordability crisis, where you see that 46% of Americans do not have more than $500 in savings. So this is not just a New York only, policy only issue. It is a pervasive issue that essentially, I believe, is based in what I term structural economic deprivation. We can have a conversation about that at another point in time. But here's the deal. When we talk about the city impact of the federal policy changes and the budget cuts on New York, we often talk about New Yorkers, and we do need to talk about the most vulnerable, 2 million, nearly 25% of our population, the lowest income, and how they are going to suffer because of the cuts in critical income supports upon which they rely significantly, but also they're going to suffer because a lot of the other things that have happened, like cuts to Pell Grants or caps on graduate and college student loans for access. Essentially what they're seeking to do is to keep the lower income community from actually getting ahead and thriving. It's a way of starving brown and black people and keeping them from actually getting ahead. It's more than simply we're trying to figure out how to take care of higher income people and pay for these tax cuts. The thing we often don't talk about is the impact on our overall municipal governance. What we're seeing is an effort at ensuring that New York has less and less financial control. We're also seeing that essentially they're trying to weaken our own democratic governance and processes. When you see a president that says that if Mamdani is elected president, that he's going to end federal funding for New York City, he's not just putting his thumb on the scale, he's putting his entire body on the scale. We have to think about, I'm not here endorsing or supporting Mamdani. What I'm actually trying to help us appreciate is that this is more about just federal cuts. It's about trying to take away New York City's ability to govern itself. So you do that by threatening the loss of federal dollars, and you do that in ways that make you can engage in fear-mongering and other tactics. So some of it is real, some of it is essentially fear-mongering and baiting.
Rafale.
So I think there's a few things. Some of them were talked about on the previous panel that I think are particularly concerning in the housing space. Obviously, if cuts to Section 8 were to actually go through, this has been the threats of that have happened before. So it's wait and see, but if they were to go through, that would have a huge impact on the most vulnerable in New York City. The CDBG program, as mentioned before, I think one of the things that I think about is the number of city municipal workers that are doing really important critical services that are funded through CDBG. Almost the entire code enforcement operation and apparatus at HPD is funded through CDBG. So if that program goes away and disappears, the city's going to have to find, because it has a statutory obligation to do code enforcement, it's going to have to find another way to fund that. And that gets to my next point, which is the cascading effect of the cuts when hard choices have to get made. Things like the funding that this New York City has been doing, the billions of dollars that New York City has been putting in to try to tackle the affordability crisis in New York through the city FEPS vouchers, which is a New York City rental assistance program, HPD's capital budget, which is $2 billion that goes into funding preservation and creation of affordable housing. The city is going to have to make those kinds of choices because of the cascading effect of of the cuts to these programs. New York City's very lucky, right? We have for decades been using New York City's own resources to help fight the affordability challenges and the housing challenges in New York City. We don't use the home. We use the home program to fund stuff, but we don't. It's not the biggest source of capital in our budget. So we're lucky in that respect. The implications for smaller communities all around New York are for cuts to those kinds of programs are really deep. But I think the bigger issue for New York City is the cascading effect of the cuts and the choices that are going to have to be made and things that are going to get impacted down the line.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Esther, and I really appreciate having this discussion. I agree with all the platitudes that have already been given. The previous panel already did a very good job of explaining some of the impacts that we're going to see, certainly around the country, but here in New York City as well. And you know, one thing that has not been said is that it is so offensive what's happening right now, because the White House and the federal government, they are taking away funding from New York City and other, you know, predominantly blue areas, blue states and cities. But they haven't helped us with our federal tax burden. So you talk about a place like New York where there's no one disputes the notion that New York City and New York State are net contributors to the federal treasury. Our folks here, New York City residents, pay a lot more in federal taxes than we ever get back through so-called grants to New York City, as well as federal services to New York City residents. Congressman Nadler will be the first to attest to that. He's been screaming that for, sorry, Jerry, for about 100 years. All right. All right, Joyce. All right. A few decades. How's that? Same thing with the state of New York. The people of New York State pay far more in federal taxes than we ever get back. So, you know, it's just offensive that, you know, there's this notion of, well, trying to make the federal government more efficient, living within its means. It's just not so. And I think Mayor Morial and Jack already mentioned that this is really, what's happening here is political. And it's just downright offensive. I think I'm out of time, but there'll be more chances.
You're not out of, yeah.
All right.
There is going to be more opportunity for you to discuss this issue,
Yeah,
but
thank
we'll
you.
move to Kathy on this big question.
I think the biggest impact is not simply the funding losses, it's the resulting political instability that I think will create chaos in the city and will make it impossible or very difficult for us to do what we have to do to mobilize a unified city around the solutions. We have been through serious fiscal crisis and federal withdrawal from the city in the past, in the 70s, and we were able to survive it because business, unions, government, community organizations came together. We created this community development movement, and we survived that. Between what's going on with the federal government and the war on cities and what's going on in our mayoral campaign, I am really worried about our ability to pull the pieces together again, and I think that's the biggest threat.
You're making me very nervous, and I started out very nervous from all of these responses. So we're going to get back to the big issues, but we want to go into some very specific questions. So I have a couple of more easy questions for everybody. We're going to start with John, because I want to turn to you as our budget expert. So as we begin to sort of unpack the Big Beautiful Bill Act, as that's its legal name, by the way, and the subsequent federal funding freezes, because there's also been a freeze, some of you may be aware of, billions of dollars of infrastructure projects where funds have been frozen for the city. I know we want to think about how we get the money back from the federal government, but in the meantime, I think we have to think about New York City and New York State and how we here navigate this new landscape in terms of policy interventions. So I don't expect great movement at the national level, at least for another year. So John, could you help us out with that?
It's going to be painful. It's going to hurt. And you know, the state legislature, along with the governor, we meet generally the first half of the year. And so the second half, the news media likes to say, well, we're not working the rest of the year. Actually, we're at home trying to figure out what the problems of our constituents are so that we can well represent them when we get to the state capitol. And we have had many discussions. There's a great deal of thought that we're going to have to, well, we won't be able to backfill all the federal resources that have been gutted, but we're going to do our best to do so. First and foremost, job one is healthcare, because this is not about taking healthcare away from, you know, again, I want to thank the previous panel for not allowing the use of the term illegal aliens. You know, aliens are those things that jump out of your stomach in spaceships. These are people who want to pursue the American dream but didn't have the chance to get the right papers. If they get sick, it's not just them and their families that get sick. The entire city gets sick. All the people in the communities get sick, whether or not you have the papers, because viruses aren't checking your papers. So healthcare policy has now almost eclipsed education as the #1 job and the #1 fiscal burden on state government. And so we're going to have to figure out how to ensure or provide health care to those hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers whose health care has just been eliminated. And there's, you know, the governor says no new taxes. Well, I remind her that so did George Bush, the first one. And we're going to have to get new resources. And one way to get new resources is by looking at those relatively few New Yorkers whose tax burdens were reduced under the bad, ugly bill. And even to get them to the same tax burden overall combination federal, state, and city to before that bad, ugly bill was passed, that would provide the state with billions of dollars. There's then going to be the pushback, oh, all these people are going to leave the state of New York. I mean, that's been an argument against increasing tax rates in New York for many decades. It doesn't quite hold water, and we're not the only state that's going to be increasing tax rates. You know, to some extent, we'd be doing what Trump said, that he says states should take more responsibility for providing for its own people. Well, that's one way we would have to do that, increasing tax rates on the highest earning New Yorkers. Education, the feeding programs. Governor Hochul's already announced $12 million last year, another $30 million this year, just to keep families from starving to death. And that's something that we're going to have to keep doing. So there's going to be a lot of fiscal pressure, no question, once we get around to the fiscal 27 budget, which the governor will propose in January, this coming January, and then we'll deliberate over the next few months. But it will be painful, no question, and that's going to leave little room for new programs, as Secretary Liu mentioned before. But you know, we're going to get through it. It's not going to be easy, but we will get through it. And I get a lot of ideas from SIPA students, so keep those ideas coming. And thank you very much for coming to this.
Thank you, John. Kathy, is that your assessment of the fiscal impacts, or do you see things somewhat differently?
I think that we ought to recognize that the biggest phenomenon here is uncertainty, and that we thought, you know, supposedly on January 5th, we were going to lose congestion pricing and the $15 billion that's going to deliver to the subway system. It didn't happen. Similarly, we thought we were going to lose the $5 billion Empire Wind project. It didn't happen. In fact, the federal government is taking over through Amtrak the renovation of Penn Station and dealing with that. I think we need to give a lot of credit to Governor Hochul for effectively navigating the craziness in the White House and that she has done a amazing job on those and a couple of other issues to make sure that we haven't had a complete disruption. Right now, we've got the Gateway Tunnel threat of $18 billion gone, et cetera. Jerry's here and will be more expert on this, but I think the rhetoric around that has been it's tied to the federal government shutdown, so that's not necessarily permanent. So I think what happened in San Francisco last week over the threat of the National Guard and the funding cuts and the ICE coming in is instructive. Probably you all read that between the mayor, Mayor Lurie, and some of the Silicon Alley leaders, they were able to cajole Trump into backing off in a way that other cities had not been successful in doing. I think that New York is prepared to follow that same model as San Francisco. I was talking to the people that put that together over the weekend, and I think that that there are ways that we can manage. The most important thing, I think, is to think about what's going to happen in the congressional elections of 2026. And I think we all have to be focused on New York's role in that will be marginal, but still important. But we all have to think about where our relationships are in the rest of the country in terms of dealing with mobilization of a vote that will get the Democratic House majority back. And I think if we can accomplish that this is a temporary crisis in terms of the level of threat right now, and that we'll still have to worry about the rule of law and the weaponization of the Justice Department and all of that, which is going on at the same time. But I think that we can, in fact, if the Democrats take back Congress from a fiscal standpoint, and Jack, I don't know if you agree, but it seems to me that that's what we all ought to be focused on right now.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Rafael. As we know, New York City, and it's been said multiple times, this evening faces an affordability crisis with a serious shortage of affordable housing. So tell us what you think is driving the housing affordability crisis, and most importantly, what you think the next mayor should focus his policy agenda on in terms of affordable housing. We will be having a male, M-A-L-E, mayor as our next mayor, so it's safe for me to say his agenda.
So I'm not going to pretend that I can explain what I think the drivers are of the housing affordability crisis in New York City in 5 minutes, because I think actually that is a good example of some of the problems that we currently face. I think it's really easy to try to, and I think the political instinct is to try to make the housing affordability crisis in New York whittle down to a soundbite. And it is an incredibly complicated topic. I think back to my history in New York City and in housing, dating all the way back to the late 1980s. And New York City was in a very different situation back then. It had a humongous housing crisis. And that housing crisis was about abandonment, it was about vacancy, it was about deterioration of neighborhoods, it was about losing population. And the city banded together, as Kathy talked about. Everyone was rowing in the same direction and attacking the problem that needed to be attacked. And policymakers made important decisions based on community feedback, community pushback, that drove housing policy in New York City for the first 20 years of my career, 35-year career in affordable housing. I think we've gotten away from that in New York. I think we're not rowing in the same direction, and I think that's one of the biggest drivers of the housing affordability crisis in New York. It's really easy to point fingers. It's a landlord problem. It's a bureaucracy problem. It's HPD's problem. It's a tax problem. I think we've lost our ability to sort of come together on the topic, and that deeply concerns me. At the end of the day, the math of affordable housing and the math of housing development in New York City is cruel. It's brutal. The math is brutal for tenants. The math is brutal for developers. The math is brutal for owners of existing buildings. The single biggest driver of, in my opinion, in my history in New York City, the single biggest driver of the affordability crisis in New York City is that we didn't adjust to going from a city where people were leaving to a city where people are coming and build commensurate with the people moving in to New York. We have been undersupplied in New York City for decades of all kinds of housing at all income levels and in all boroughs. That, at the end of the day, is the driver of all of the ills we see today. The gentrification, the rents increasing in neighborhoods all across the city. All of that is spurred by the fact that we haven't built enough to house the people that want to be in New York. Having been in New York City in the late 80s, having people want to be in New York and move to New York is a good thing, right? We should embrace that. And we should embrace it with policies that allow us to build and allow us to grow our housing stock in a way that will allow us to adapt and adjust. The problem is that we're so far behind that it's going to take decades to catch up. And so the real question for the next mayor is going to be, what do we do now? How do we deal with the problem we're facing now? And I give an enormous amount of credit to every mayor since I came to New York. Has had a housing strategy and a housing policy and has invested in affordable housing. And that has continued through up until this time, and I know that it will continue beyond, regardless of who the mayor is. And so I think the bigger question is, what are the policies that the mayor is going to put in place that make it feel like New York is open for business, for development? That there's a housing friendly attitude in New York, that the agencies that are involved in housing development, Department of Buildings, HPD, HDC, those agencies are friendly to development and building and care about development and building. And then the second piece is that the policies that the mayor puts in place and the impact that has on the existing housing stock. Because if we lose the existing housing stock while we're building, we're never going to get ahead. And I think one of the biggest problems that we face right now is that the math for existing affordable and rent-regulated housing in New York doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the rents are too damn high for the tenants, but they're too damn low for the building owners to be able to operate the buildings and maintain the buildings in a way that will ensure that those buildings last into the future.
Raphael, you forgot to pitch the charter amendments?
Oh, yeah, well, I had those on my list, but I was running out of time.
I know.
So the two things,
It is a priority.
the two things on my list for immediate action around a building environment are, continuing to pursue City of Yes that was passed and that will have a significant impact, and in particular in conjunction with the charter, the charter amendments that are on the ballot next week. All of them are important. They all will help create this building environment that is important. And then the third thing.
And they were not Mayor Adams' idea. They came out of a commission that Lizette and I were both on, which is a pro-housing committee.
1,000%.
No, this is an important point. I'm going to ask Jennifer.
It's a very important point.
Yes.
If you
I'm
haven't
gonna ask
voted
Jennifer
yet,
to jump
vote
in
yes.
After Kathy. Kathy, you want to comment on the housing thing also?
Well, I just did that.
I didn't miss.
Didn't you hear me?
I heard you. The propositions, everyone, make sure to turn over your ballot. Go to who's on the ballot. It will tell you what those propositions are. We are nonpartisan, so I'm not telling you how to vote.
I will.
But Kathy will. Okay.
So let me just say that like bow down to Kathy. And there are several people who served on the commission who helped to advance these housing charter revision proposals. One of the things, my responsibility at every turn is to make sure that I'm also, the community, you talk to the community, but is to make sure that we make sure that all in the community, to the extent that we're able, that they're heard and their concerns are heard. And a lot of what I'm hearing right now about these housing charter revision proposals is that we are actually diminishing the community's voice.
That is not true.
So, no,
It's
but
in
my
no
point, wait,
way-
let me finish. Let me finish. The reason why I'm raising it is actually so you can respond to it.
Thank you. It is not true. This does nothing to the community board's role in this process. What this does is expedite the process. It allows for more power for the borough president, which actually increases, and it allows for more power to the Speaker of the City Council. And one of the frustrations we've had in moving project forward and getting stuff done is that the Speaker has, the role of Speaker has weakened a lot in the last actually 12 years or so. And as a result, what we used to be able to do, if there was an obstreperous person on the council who was objecting to a affordable housing project, this creates an appeals process. And this is after you've gone through the community board, et cetera. This creates an appeals process where the city council speaker, the relevant borough president, who don't have this power at all now, the relevant borough president and the mayor are able to override a veto by the city council and the objection of the city council member. So this is, again, this is looking at the bigger interests, and this is one of the things that we have to do. We have to start looking at not the parochial interests of not special interests, not local parochial interests. We have to start looking at the interests of the city. Or, you know, it's 10 community boards that have produced like 90% of the affordable housing in the last decade. We have to change that. We have to be able to take that.
So wait. You all about to take my time. I gave you some of my time, but now I got it right. Okay.
Giving you your time back.
No.
Go
That
ahead.
was my time. I'll skip my
No,
love it.
I'm giving you your time. There's enough.
So just on the housing, I do not profess to be a housing expert, but what I am more expert in is the experience of people on the ground who face housing problems. And, what I think about is, we have the quantitative data, and then we also have to look at qualitative data. We have to look at the experiences of individuals and families who are struggling. And I think about the fact that when my husband moved to New York City in 1993 to go to business school, he was able to afford an apartment for himself. When my sister graduated from college and became a teacher, she was able to afford an apartment in Brooklyn, New York. Today, young people graduating college, graduating from grad school, unless they are going into, business, and have a business degree from Columbia or perhaps a law degree from Columbia, they're hard pressed to get an apartment on their own. Do we take that into consideration when we're looking at affordable housing, that very often families with low income cannot compete with young persons who are tripling, quadrupling up in an apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, where they're going to split a bedroom, and so therefore they're bringing 4 incomes to the table, and a family, 2 adults working with 2-3 young children, cannot compete with that. I think that the challenge that we have so often when we talk about affordable housing is we don't look at why it's actually unaffordable. We focus on, okay, what do we need to do more by way of development? How do we increase the supply? Sometimes we look at income, we look at median wages. We don't appreciate sometimes the fact that when we look at low and medium income earners, that their wages in New York City have not grown exponentially in the way that we've seen for the bottom half around the rest of the United States. Their wages grew between 2019 and 23 significantly. Here in New York City, that has not been the case. So when you don't have, an increase in your wages, but you see an increase in housing, but you also see an increase in childcare, you see an increase in healthcare costs, incidental medical costs, you see an increase in transportation costs. If the money's not there, and frankly, low and middle income people do not have the wealth, they don't have the family members who are subsidizing there are apartment rentals. If you're not taking all of that into consideration and not looking at this issue holistically, and you're just thinking it's more housing, that's not going to address the problem. And I think that that is something that we don't do enough of.
I'd like to expand
It's
on.
an important segue, and I'll let John make this point, and then we'll move into this question about taking all of these things into consideration at once. I know that's difficult for a lot of people to do, but in fact, there's a tremendous interaction effect around affordability that Jennifer just alluded to, and I'm going to ask her about that in a moment. But John.
I won't, it'll take too long, but I will only very briefly mention that in addition to law degrees and business degrees, if you get an MPA or an MIA at SIPA, you're going to do pretty well too.
We hope so. It doesn't compete, I'm afraid, if they go into government. Thanks, John. Jennifer, I want to ask you about the cost of childcare as another major factor, and you just alluded to this in your remarks in the affordability crisis in New York. You just did a report with Federation for Protestant Welfare on the true cost of living. Could you tell us more about how the child care crisis relates to that and how you think the next mayor should respond?
Absolutely. So the report that FPWA released is a policy brief looking at the issues, the challenges that New Yorkers, low and middle income New Yorkers are facing when it comes to the city not being affordable. One of the things I should share with you is that I've told both of the mayoral nominees that the response to affordability is not just policies that center on affordability, but rather center on economic security. That what we do time and time again is we just try to meet the moment with the crisis response, not appreciating that the key to everybody surviving and thriving, as people with essential wealth know, is economic security. We talk so much about income when we talk very little about wealth. But people who are thriving have a modicum of wealth. We never center on wealth in America and how wealth makes a difference. When you have an emergent need of some sort, you have an accident, you have an emergent medical crisis, you lose your job. It's not whether your income is keeping you, it's whether you have some savings in the bank that's going to hold you, you have some assets. The report that we released centers on the true cost of economic security, a measure that was developed following the New York City Racial Justice Commission and New Yorkers' passage of the true cost of living mandate. So I served as chair of the New York City Racial Justice Commission, and what we found when engaging with New Yorkers is people were repeatedly, continuously saying, not just the rent is too damn high, childcare is too damn high, the incidental medical costs are too damn high. And what we realize is that when we're using the federal poverty measure, which says that a family for living anywhere in the United States needs just $32,150 to not be poor, technically, that essentially we are engaging in, again, what I call structural economic deprivation. We know that a family for living anywhere in America cannot cut it on $32,150. We know that. And so what we pushed for with the mandate, the proposal, was to establish a true cost of living based in economic security, a measure that looks at the costs to meet your daily needs, to save and plan for your future, for retirement, for your child's education, for incidental emergent medical accidental expenses, right? Car breaks down and you need to fix your car and not worry about whether or not you can put food on the table. And that also looks at the resources that people have to actually meet those costs. And what that measure, let me back up and say, New York City voted for it. The electorate voted for it by 81%. We actually have the measure. The Urban Institute created it for the city of New York. This mayor has yet to release it. We also, FPWA commissioned the Urban Institute to develop the measure for the nation, looking at county-level data. And what the measure tells us is that when you look at New York City using Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Queens, and the Bronx as data, what it tells us is that 62% of New Yorkers are economically insecure, meaning they do not have the resources to meet their daily needs and plan and save for their futures, right? It tells us that 72% of families with children in New York City are not economically secure. It tells us that 88% of families in the Bronx are not economically secure. They cannot pay for rent. They can't meet their child care costs. They are challenged when it comes to health care, and they're going to be all the more challenged with Medicaid being cut, with the Affordable Care Act subsidies going away, and the increase in the premiums that will result from that. They are economically insecure. We talk about childcare as though it's a one-off. Yes, the average cost of childcare is $17,000. When you are, as a family, with children, that the resource gap for you, when you look at the true cost of economic insecurity, is about $53,000. $17,000 for childcare is not your only concern. It's rent, right? It's, as I said, it's healthcare costs. It's more than that. But here's the deal. When we talk only about childcare and we don't look at all of these other costs, when we don't look at how housing costs grow when you have more than one, more than two, more than three children, that's an increased cost. When you look at healthcare and how it can grow when you have more than one adult or two adults in the family and you have children. So the response to childcare, yes, what I think we need to do is look at policies like universal childcare. But I have cautioned both of the mayoral nominees that it's not just now everybody. I'm just going to put it out there. I actually, it's not talked about a lot. I actually designed the universal pre-kindergarten program for first Mayor Bloomberg and then for Mayor Bill de Blasio,
Yes.
right? Everybody gets universal pre-K. But here's the problem. If you do the same for childcare, you actually have the challenge of probably growing the wealth gap. Because people who don't need 18, 20, 25,000 in childcare now get a boost in their discretionary income to actually maybe, push the housing market up in terms of cost of housing. We don't focus on that. So I think we need universal childcare. But what you should do is look at the threshold of economic insecurity and make sure that those who are not economically secure get child care, and do not give it to people who actually are above the threshold.
I just have to jump in quickly. I promised I wouldn't, but since I didn't coordinate with Jennifer, our Data in Community Speaks supports that approach. Universal childcare is all well and good, but we need to target in communities that have high needs now and not increase the wealth of people who have wealth.
I'll quickly say that, I've asked this question and it's hard to ascertain the answer. I believe in doing good while doing no further harm. And I believe that we should learn from the policies that we advance. My father was a civil rights leader, and he would say, sometimes, and this is going to sound controversial, but he'd say, sometimes I wonder if when we move beyond Plessy v. Ferguson and push for Brown v. Board of Education, did we actually appreciate the consequences of our actions? And he's speaking as a civil rights leader. I sometimes wonder if when we actually brought about universal pre-kindergarten and we actually put $20,000, $25,000 in the hands of people who actually didn't need that money, what did they do with that? Were they now able to go and build more wealth? Did that increase the wealth gap and actually contribute to the affordability crisis? People tell me it's hard to answer.
Okay, I'm going to ask Kathy to speak for a moment, and then I'm going to direct a question to you, Kathy.
Well, this is my last speech, so I'm going to...
Can I direct my question, and then you can do
direct
both
your
at the same time? Thanks, okay. I mean, you're here, and we have to take advantage of your knowledge, and we know that we are about to enter a really risky economic situation in New York, and I'd like you to talk to us about how government can work with the business community on policies that mitigate these risks. I think, not enough people have been speaking about that or thinking about it.
So just to be clear, the New York economy is strong. We are the #1 destination for college graduates. We're the #1 destination for college applicants. Our talent pool is the most diverse and strongest in the world, in any city. Our economy is flourishing. We are the center of applied AI. We're not developers of AI. We're we're the buyers of it. The financial industry is critical because the financial industry has built the tech industry in New York City because it is the first adapter of new technology, and it has the money to invest in making that happen, and that's what created Silicon Alley and brought everybody here. And that is the high growth sector of our economy. So our economy is in great shape if we don't muck it up. That's why I mentioned my first point was political instability will muck it up. That creates an uncertainty in the economic atmosphere that will drive people out. Number two, the local and state tax base is not sufficient to replace federal entitlement programs. It will not work. There is no way to tax our way out of these problems, and I know John would be disappointed if I didn't bring that up. The loss of state and local tax deductibility for New York City and the other cities in blue states across the country was a direct financial and political hit that was huge. All those people that lost that deductibility, the high earners that we want to tax again, I'm not talking about billionaires here, I'm talking about two-income professional couples, I'm talking about the heart of the financial industry. Those people are all paying 55% of their income in taxes now with no federal recognition of the state and local tax burden, and that has totally undermined our ability to support ourselves. So I think everybody's got to think about, we have to take back the federal government.
Okay, I think that's a critically important point that isn't talked about enough. In this context, John, do you want to chime in?
Well, I agree with everything that Kathy said. We have to take back the federal government. The big problem is that every day you wake up. I mean, I wake up by listening to the news. The clock radio goes. Yeah, I still use the clock radio. And I knew you were going to say that, Kathy. I told my son to hang up the phone. He said, "Where do you want me to hang it?" You wake up, and every day, it's like a new thing that you say, wait, I thought you couldn't do that. And every day in this country and coming from the White House, it's something new that we never would have conceived of even a few years ago. And this is all playing into a much larger plan here. Because I'm not sure that we can take back the federal government. I hate to say it. That is what worries me the most. You know, when Trump outright in 2024, when he was campaigning, he said, that's going to be the last election. And, you know, this week, he's talking about, yeah, he'd be happy to run for a third term. I mean, we thought you couldn't do that. But that happens every day. So, this is a president who has now co-opted the major news media, particularly the corporate media, and the Supreme Court. So we're in a very dangerous time. Next year, clearly, we got to start with the municipal elections, and we should not be afraid to make a statement. I am not with Democrats who say, hey, let's just try to make the best of it. No, we need a radical approach to something that has happened radically in the federal government. And then next year, we need to take back Congress, if at all possible. Even if we take back Congress, there's going to be election deniers in those areas that elect members of Congress that are not with the Trump agenda. So it's very worrisome. But now more than ever do we have to put our heads together to come up with the right solutions and radical solutions. And we're not going to get out of this radical state by just business as usual solutions.
I want to ask us one last question, us as if I'm going to answer, which I won't, as a sort of lightning round to refocus our attention on the next mayor of New York and what he will be able to do. So the new mayor we see is going to have some serious challenges, even if he has a strong economy now. We know that the White House would love to just destroy it. When he takes office. So this is a sort of non-academic question in a way. It's really for our panel and people who have been in the mix and think about what you have to do when you get in office. On day one, or as one of our panelists preferred, the first 100 days, I like the day one formulation, but I'll go with either way. What are the 2 issues you think this mayor needs to address immediately? We know that day one, first 100 days, is critical to what gets done. So I'll start with you, Jennifer, and we'll just go down the line.
So I served as the co-chair of the de Blasio transition, and I'll never forget when, after being appointed, going and sitting with Patty Harris, who was Mayor Bloomberg's first deputy mayor, and I'd worked for Bloomberg, so I said to Patty, what do we need to be focusing on the first day? And she looked at me like I had 2 heads, and she said, duh, the weather. And I was like, the weather? And she said, you could have a blizzard on the first day. First day of Mayor de Blasio's administration, there was pretty much a blizzard. And so she wasn't wrong. But I think, when I think about what is happening right now, the fallout from this election, I think that the next mayor in the first 100 days has to center on how does he unify New York City? How does he bring us together to help us appreciate that this affordability crisis is everybody's crisis. It's not just low and middle income earners, it's everybody's crisis, because the ripple effect of it, more and more middle income people leaving, taxes leaving the city. More and more low income people, having to leave or like hiding in their homes is going to create problems with respect to who's out there doing the work and helping everybody else to move, helping the trains to move, all of that. So I think we need to work on unifying.
Kathy, just going to say it quick.
No, I'm not going to say anything else. I said my piece.
Okay, you don't want to say what's the big issue. That's all.
I have to leave.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you
That's
for
my
coming.
big issue.
All
Clearly
right.
is living the life.
Right? That's what it looks like.
Rafal.
I think it's focusing on governance and hiring the best people who know how to run the city and can plow the streets and pick up the garbage. And governing a city is not as sexy as running a campaign, and so you have to focus on the stuff that people are going to care about.
John.
Yeah, I think the first day one, which actually starts on November 5th, the new mayor is going to have a senior team in place by January 1st, and I think it can be done. The set of deputy mayors as well as the key commissioner roles, meaning the police, fire, schools chancellor, those positions have to be in place, especially if you've been criticized as a young person with little experience, or if you're an old guy who really doesn't want to be mayor. You have to have a strong team in place by day one.
Kathy, one more last word.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I think they got it.
Okay, we all agree. Thanks, everybody. You're all amazing. I appreciate you. Now, Mayor
Please
Nutter's
welcome
going to
the
close
stage,
for us.
Michael Nutter. Please welcome to the stage, Michael Nutter.
Let's give a big round of applause to, is this not on? Test one. Anyway, huge round of applause to all of our panelists, all of our moderators. Certainly Dean Karen and the entire team here at SIPA and the Institute of Global Politics. He's been mentioned a couple times, but more shout-outs from the stage. But in a more formal way, can we please recognize Congressman Adler and his wife, Joyce? Thank you, sir, for your great service. I've attended more than a few panels and meetings and discussions here at SIPA. I have to say, at least from my perspective, I've not witnessed one that was more focused, more intelligent, that had more information, talking about real issues from real people who actually know what they're talking about. And I think that this is the kind of forum, these are the kinds of events that SIPA and the IGP are really built for. Evidence-based analysis, real facts, real discussion, real debate. Certainly that was quite entertaining. My good friend and colleague, Mayor Morial, and the representative from the Manhattan Institute. I mean, that was serious. And I think, a legitimate disagreement about some real issues. And so this is an exciting time for us. I think we are built for this in a variety of ways, and the dean and all of the leadership here have been getting SIPA in a position to really highlight the serious issues that real people are facing on the ground. New York City is in the midst of one of the most critical elections you all have seen in a while. And so this coming together of SIPA, the IGP, a new administration is an exciting time in New York. And as the person standing between you and a drink or whatever else you want to do tonight, without any delay, please enjoy the reception. But New Yorkers, go vote. Thank you.